Hello, and welcome back to the Going Off Track podcast. I am Catherine. We are back behind the desk, and let's talk, I think, about the biggest. I want to call it the biggest shock, but I also don't think that a lot of us are entirely surprised that this specific team is struggling. I think that we're just a little surprised to the extent, and that's what the heck is going on in Aston Martin. Are they okay? And I think the answer is no. And it's kind of funny. We thought going into this 3 weeks of preseason testing that Williams would be the story of the sessions, considering they missed the entirety of the Barcelona shakedown. But Aston Martin also did not get a lot of running time in Barcelona either. So basically everybody's screwed. But Aston Martin is really, they came into the season with, sky high expectations. We have been talking about the Newey car and when we were going to get the 2026 Newey car, basically since 2024. It's been almost a year and a half, give or take. Newey announced that he was going to be leaving 2024. And then there was a little bit of like, will they, won't they, with who he was going to go to. Ferrari had a big push to pick him up. And then it ended up that he was going to go to Aston Martin, which I think everybody was like, that's okay. We would rather him go to a team that needs assistance and not a team that can't get out of their own way. But as I have said, we will probably talk more about, Ferrari's engineering woes and Ferrari's woes in general as we go through the season. But Adrian Newey, if you don't know, is, as Max Verstappen is a savant when it comes to driving F1 cars, Adrian Newey is a savant when it comes to building F1 cars. His cars have won 12 World Constructors Championships and 14 individual drivers championships, including that run from 2010 to 2013 with Red Bull and Sebastian Vettel. And I know I've been saying for, I think, like 2 years now that I will one day watch every race of the 2010 season. I promise it will happen eventually, I swear. But until then, you can watch every race of the 2016 season, which is linked above. And, Aston Martin had, they had 2 decent years finishing in P5 before we had the 2025 season where they finished in that very disappointing P7. They were very solidly like the best of the rest behind Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren. They had some really good results. They were solidly in the points on a regular basis. And then last year, it's like, Fernando couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag and Lance Stroll is in the car. So there's a lot there's a lot riding on their success for this season. Fernando has said if 2026 is not a great year, he'll sign another year for 2027 and then maybe retire after that. Or, if this is as best as it's going to be, he'll finish after 2026. So we really don't know. And we'll talk individually about the drivers later. But the other kicker here is Aston Martin is changing engine suppliers going into the season. So we got brand new car, which everyone has brand new cars because we're in that new regulation, and brand new engines moving from Mercedes, which we know that their Mercedes is consistent. It's reliable. It's Mercedes doesn't want to be a manufacturer to so many customer teams anymore, which is why they, let Aston Martin moved on to them from Honda, and then Honda was leaving Red Bull and the Red Bull family of networks. So moving, there's a lot of new pieces here in this new regulation for this new Aston Martin. And you would think that maybe they would be solidly decent, maybe kind of okay. Instead, what we learned from testing is that they're 4.5 seconds behind the front running teams, which is real bad. We saw in the first week of Bahrain, they didn't even clear 100 laps. And when you have teams that, Max Verstappen on day 1 of the first week of Bahrain testing, he clocked in at 136 laps. Lando Norris on day 2 was 149 and Oscar Piastri was 161. So Lance Stroll had 72 lap days on days 1 and day 3, and Fernando had 98. So to compare that's not a lot of information, and information is the key to these testing periods. It's the key to figuring out how to bring a competitive car, or even a moderately competitive car, or a car that is a good starting point, to the first race in Australia. Then we went into, let's call it, things got worse. We go into Bahrain week 2. First day, everybody kind of split time in the cars except for Max Verstappen. Max Verstappen was the only one who didn't get into the car on day one of week 2. Lance Stroll clocked in 26 laps. Fernando Alonso clocked in at 28. To compare to the high that day, that was George Russell in the Mercedes at 76 laps. So nobody was really blowing the top off with lap numbers, because most teams, what they did is they had one driver on day 2 and one driver on day 3, and then they split the drivers on day 1. But then we go into day 2, Fernando Alonso 68 laps. That's not great. It's the low so far. Max Verstappen had 139 that day, which was, I think, far and away one of the highs. But then the next day, Honda released this not very encouraging statement. It will be here. And it says, our last run with Fernando Alonso yesterday showed a battery related issue that impacted our test plan with the Aston Martin Aramco Formula One team. Full names. Since then, we have been carrying out simulations on the test bench in HRC Sakura, which is in Japan, where Honda is based out of. Due to the shortage of power unit parts, we have adapted today's run plan to be very limited and consist of only short stints. And I'm sure what can you imagine a short stint looks like for the third, final, last day of testing before everyone packs it in? Lance Stroll did 6 laps. In comparison, Arvid Lindblad, who is the one rookie of the season who is driving for V-Carb alongside Liam Lawson, he had 165 laps, which if I'm correct, and I think I am, I did not confirm this, but I think I'm right, that is the high the entire testing period. And when you look at the total numbers, that leaves Honda with only 128 laps of data to work with in regards to the performance of their power unit. So when you don't have a lot of information on your power unit, you also can't really determine what problems you may have with the chassis, because those are the significant portions of being able to successfully have a car that could be a race winning car or even a point scoring car, is the power unit and the chassis efficiency. And we learned in the F1 movie, which if you want to hear our thoughts on that, it is also linked above, that in the simulator scene between Brad Pitt and Kerry Condon's characters, he was asking about what information can you get out of, just the wind tunnel. And, she said that there were a lot of things that you basically have to account for mathematically that you can't actually physically test for in the wind tunnel, which is accurate to real, for realsies, which is why these weeks of testing are so important. And of course, why we had 2 weeks of testing this year when typically we only have 1 week of testing, but they gave a second week to the teams because we're moving into not just a new regulation, because we moved from regulations in 2021 to 2022. Those were a regulation change, but these regulations are so much more significant that they gave that second week. So you have 128 laps of data for Honda. Mercedes, which is provides engines to multiple other teams. Mercedes had 1,554 laps of data to work with on their power unit. Red Bull, between the Red Bull team and the V-Carb team, had 736. And then you get to Honda, which Honda is always, I'm not going to say always, but typically Honda is a very risk-averse type team. In our team genealogy series, when we talked about the Honda portion and the Honda existence, which that entire playlist is also going to be linked above, and we're linking everything, guys. Honda is very when things are good, they are so happy to be here, but when things are bad, they're like, okay, we're not going to do this anymore, which honestly, when they announced that they were leaving Red Bull, it sounded like that was the reason why. And then the announcement to move to Aston Martin was honestly a surprise, but it's not promising. Does this mean that, the season is already over for Aston Martin? No, this isn't like the situation last season at the beginning of the year with Jack Doohan, where it's like Jack Doohan's career in Formula One is over before it started. Fortunately, he's now the reserve driver at Haas, so he is no longer dealing with Alpine and Flavio Briatore. But at the same time, Aston Martin has a very steep hill to climb, especially since, as far as I know, they haven't really done a race run type run plan yet because they just haven't had the time. Race runs they're critical, especially when you look at the practice sessions that we have going into regular races. You want the team to have as much information as possible, whether it's on a qualifying run or it's on a race run. You want them to have that information so that they can make a run plan, so you can decide what you're going to do in qualifying and during the race, and how are you going to set up the car for as much success as possible. And Aston Martin doesn't have that information yet. So that's a big yikes. So what Aston Martin is going to have to do is they're going to have to figure out, what is the issue with the power unit, which could be fixable, should be fixable. I mean, it's Honda. They've been doing this forever. And then if there are issues with the chassis, Adrian Newey can probably figure those out, in his sleep. But in conjunction, you have to make sure that you're figuring that out and that you have time and that you're not, setting yourself so far back that you're going to end up, P11 out of 11 teams, because of course we have an 11th team. It's Cadillac. Coming up next episode, I will give you a primer on all of the information about them, and also, are they going to be good or not, which remains to be seen. I did some research. It's going to be fun. But from a where do we go from here? Obviously, where we go from here is Australia. They know that there's a power unit issue. They're going to be working night and day within the regulations to fix this power unit, issue. And I saw, clickbait headlines are everywhere. Media literacy, very important. But I saw a headline that said that two drivers were at risk of not appearing in the first race in Australia due to penalties. And I'm like, okay, that's weird, because number one, Ollie Behrman doesn't have the penalty points yet. He has not hit the magic number of 12. That is going to be something that we're going to have to look out for this season. And number two, Valtteri Bottas does have a 5-place grid penalty from his last race in 2024, because he didn't drive in 2025 and is now back with Cadillac in 2026. But that's not going to stop him from racing. So, when there's a headline that stupid, you have to look at the article. And the article was talking about how, could Aston Martin be at risk of not being on the starting grid for the race in Australia if their car is so bad? And the answer, first off, is technically there's a rule, but nobody enforces it anymore, and nobody is going to start enforcing it out of nowhere. And this is called the 107% rule. And this rule says that a driver must record a time within 107% of the fastest Q1 time. Remember, we have Q1, Q2, Q3 in qualifying in order to compete in the race. So if Aston Martin is 4.5 seconds off the lead pace, that could put them outside of the 107%. But like I said, nobody enforces that rule anymore. So if Aston Martin is too slow to be good in qualifying, they'll just be P19 and P20 on the grid. But the key here is be careful with what you read, and know that the 107% rule is something that literally has not been enforced in forever. Like Logan Sargent, who used to drive for Williams, he ran afoul of 107% a couple of times in his short F1 career. And guess what? He still ran those races. If the Aston Martin is so slow that it causes danger to the other drivers, they will be black and white flagged, or just straight up black flagged and forced to retire. But they won't not start. So don't worry about that. But there are 3 factors that we're going to be talking about right now in order to have a successful car that you can put on the grid that could, score you some points, get you some podiums, maybe win you some races. Number 1, power unit. Number 2, chassis. Number 3, driver. And as we know, Aston Martin has 2 drivers. Everybody has 2 drivers, but number 1 is Fernando Alonso. Fernando Alonso is a 2-time world champion. He is 44 years old. He has been there, done that, and has a F1 career older than I think like a third of the grid. Then you have Lance Stroll, who is the heavily documented fact that Lance Stroll has never beaten a teammate in the WDC in his entire career, and he's been around a while. I will give to Lance Stroll, he is clearly good enough to be in Formula One, but he would not still be in Formula One if it wasn't for the fact that his father owns his team. And I think that is just a fact that I think is more of a realistic fact than when Emily and I said that there was no way Toto Wolff was going to put Kimi Antonelli in the Mercedes after Lewis Hamilton departed from Ferrari. And then not only were we so wrong about that, but our clip about us being wrong about that ended up in the Kimi Antonelli documentary. And I'm pretty sure that Emily or I are the first people to say Kimi Antonelli's name in the Kimi Antonelli documentary called The Seat on Netflix. You should watch it. But I do think that had Lawrence Stroll not bought Aston Martin to, it's not a vanity project for his son, but it is the way that his son stays on the grid. Had that not happened, Lance Stroll would not still be here. And I have said multiple times that the best thing that Aston Martin could do for the future of the team is move on from Lance Stroll as a driver. And I know that's a very awkward conversation for, the Strolls to have, but how much longer are we going to have to wait? And I think that this year actually might be very indicative of what is going to be the future of the drivers for Aston Martin, purely because if they do end up with a good car and and one driver doing well, Fernando, and one driver who can't drive his way out of a paper bag, okay, that might be a little bit mean, but you know what I mean, in Lance Stroll, then that may mean that we might have to have that conversation, might have to shift and, I don't know, call up Yuki Tsunoda because he's taking a year off this year to do show runs. And if you saw that the Red Bull kind of went kaboom in the last show run this past weekend in San Francisco, Yuki is available. Yuki is also fine. He managed to get out of the car and it didn't really explode, but it did catch fire, which that happens with F1 cars. If you're new to the F1 this season, sometimes they catch fire, but like not in a bad way or not in a life-threatening way. The drivers are trained for this. It's okay. But, and then you have, Fernando. And Fernando has not had the best history with Honda as an engine supplier. We all know in 2015, when Fernando Alonso called the Honda engine in his McLaren a GP2 engine, which GP2, for those of you who don't know, is basically the equivalent of Formula 2 at the time. And that was his first season with McLaren following his stint at Ferrari. Prior to that was when he won Tour World Championships with Renault in 2005 and 2006. And so to come to, a McLaren that was not the McLaren that we see, the pre-Papaya McLaren, it was very difficult for him to navigate that. And Fernando Alonso is not a driver who is going to mince words or wait until he's off radio to say what he's really thinking. So if Honda cannot figure out what they need to figure out, then I think we are going to see a very unhappy Fernando Alonso who might just decide, bye, which would be very unfortunate because obviously he had such a great career, when I was 15 years old, and has, he's also good enough to stay in Formula One and compete at a high level when you're 44 years old, when at this point, 44 years old is geriatric. Shall we say, it compared to the ages of the other drivers. Like I said, there are many drivers who were not alive when Fernando's career started. Lewis was 16 years old when Fernando first got onto the grid. Arvid Lindblad was born in 2007. Fernando's career started in 2001. So there's your context. Now, is there hope for success for Aston Martin to not have a terrible year? Of course there is. Honda, like I said, Honda has worked with Red Bull for years. They've been working in Formula One for ever. They know how to fix things and, figure things out. It's just a matter of how long is it going to take for them to find some pace, have an engine that functions. That, this is, Stake had a really bad start when they took over from Alfa Romeo that they kind of never really recovered from. But, last year wasn't the worst, and we'll see how they are as Audi this year. And of course, we had McLaren's horrendous start in 2023, where their Bahrain race was just an absolute nightmare. And look at them now. They are back-to-back Constructors Championships with the reigning Drivers' Champion, which I don't want to talk about because Papaya rules are going to be as much of a nightmare this season, if not worse this season than they were last season. But, we'll go from there. But what do I expect out of Aston Martin coming into Australia? Not much. Not much at all. I mean, is that a bad thing? No. But it will be the real question will be, how long is it going to take the team to bring in an upgrade, to be able to figure out this power unit issue? Obviously, between the end of testing and and the beginning of first practice, there is a solid couple of weeks for them to work. Every team will be working. So there is every opportunity that we come into Australia and we have like night and day from testing. But I don't really think so, primarily because testing is going to reveal a lot of very critical information, and that lack of information is going to cause Aston Martin to struggle for a while. Hopefully not too long, but you never know. And basically it is just, we don't know, and we also aren't going to know how Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll are going to be able to outdrive these cars, because outdriving these cars is also very important and very valuable to be able to do. And I think there's one driver of the two that might be able to be a little bit more capable of doing that than the other. We'll see. But that is definitely something to look out for going into our first week of the year. I cannot believe Formula One season is coming back. Obviously, we have a lot of stuff in between now and then. We have Drive to Survive Season 8 coming out the end of this week. So lots to catch up on and get ready for before we head down to Australia. But up next, there will be another episode on a topic to be named later. Make sure you subscribe, you hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss it, and leave a 5-star review on the podcast platform that you may or may not be listening to this on, so that I can continue to inflict more of my F1 opinions to the greater population. That's what we've got so far tonight. Thanks for going off track with me, and we will see you in the next episode.